They were still chewing when I reached into my clutch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just slid the manila folder across the Christmas table, right between the gravy boat and the cranberry sauce, until it stopped in front of Brandon. He looked up mid-toast wineglass, raised fork in hand, smirking, confident, cruel. "Merry Christmas," I said. He chuckled, thought it was flirtation, until he opened the folder. Inside, a notarized copy of our prenup clause, 6 bolded in red. A single line: "If Brandon initiates divorce, Stephanie Claire Whitaker retains full control of all marital assets, custody negotiations, and shared estate property." His smirk cracked. Everyone else kept eating at first. Nate, his best friend, paused mid-bite. His father leaned in. His sister glanced down at her lap. And Brandon. He blinked once slowly, as if the ink on the page might disappear if he stared long enough. It didn't. If you've ever been underestimated in your own home by someone who thought they owned the ending, subscribe to Revenge with Seren. Some betrayals don't need volume, just timing. But this didn't start with a prenup. It started with a bet. 5 days before Christmas, I was carrying a tray of drinks when I overheard Brandon laughing in the hallway, his voice smug, bouncing off the walls. "You think she'll cry when she gets the papers?" Nate chuckled. "She'll crumble." I didn't drop the tray. I didn't say a word. I just walked back into the dining room and smiled. That was the moment I stopped being his wife and started becoming something else. That night, I went to the attic and pulled down the fireproof envelope Jenny had helped me prepare. Inside, the prenup he'd signed 2 years ago, drunk off bourbon and overconfidence. Back then, he'd joked, "No one reads these anyway." I did. I read every line. Then I rewrote one. Because I wasn't planning revenge. I was preparing for freedom. Back at the table, Brandon cleared his throat. "What is this?" he asked. I smiled gently. "My Christmas present to you." Then I reached for the gold-wrapped box beside me and placed it in front of him. A perfectly tied ribbon. A card that said simply, "Open second." He tore it open like a spoiled child on Christmas morning. Inside, a black and white sonogram photo. 8 weeks. Dated. Labeled. His jaw didn't drop. It just hung there. "I'm pregnant," I said softly. "Congratulations. You're not just losing a wife tonight. You're about to lose custody too." His mother gasped. His father sat back. Nate went dead quiet. No one moved. Not even me. Because I had spent a year documenting the man across from me. His jokes. His business trips. His passwords. His cruelty disguised as charisma. I didn't need to scream. I needed to present. "I filed 2 days ago," he said, desperate now. "This won't hold up. I filed first." I leaned forward, steady. "That's exactly why it will hold up. Clause 6 only activates if you file first." "Which you did." He flipped through the folder with trembling fingers. A man looking for a parachute inside a birthday card. But the damage had already landed. Silent. Legal. Irreversible. Because Christmas revenge doesn't come wrapped in rage, it comes in calm. "You planned this," he muttered. "No," I said. "I prepared." That's when the silence fell heavy, real, and cinematic. Not the awkward kind. The kind that tells you every single person at the table just realized who they've been underestimating. And who they won't underestimate again. I sat back in my chair, reached for my wine glass, and sipped. No flinching, no second guessing. Just a woman who had quietly stopped playing the role and started writing the script. Brandon kept flipping through the papers like he was trying to find a loophole in his own failure. Clause 6 stared back at him, bolded, dated, notarized. He looked like a man reading his own autopsy. Jenny had rewritten that clause herself. "She's not just my best friend, she's a lawyer who learned how to stitch fire into fine print." And Brandon, he signed it after 3 bourbons and a toast to just formality. I had watched him do it. I'd even slid the pen across the table. Now he was the one holding the pen like it might bite him. "This can't be real," he whispered. "It's enforceable," I replied calmly. "You filed first. You triggered the clause." He looked up, pale fingers twitching. Across the table, his father adjusted his glasses, staring at the header like it might be a joke. His mother clutched her wine glass like it could save her. Nate, silent now, kept his eyes on his plate. Brandon leaned back in his chair and said the first thing he could think of. "This isn't fair." Neither was betting I'd cry. He blinked, and I saw it hit not just the legal reality, but the loss of narrative control. Because he wasn't the only one preparing something. I'd been building this exit for months. Every harmless joke he made at my expense, every time he dismissed me in front of others, every trip he swore was just business, while I sat home Googling the names on his receipts, I documented all of it. Not with rage, with timestamps, with screenshots, with witnesses. That prenup. It wasn't revenge. It was strategy. "Do you really think this'll hold up in court?" he asked, grasping at air. I didn't blink. "We won't need court. You already lost. You handed me every advantage." He turned to his father, desperate. "Dad, tell her this isn't how it works." But the older man was still reading the document. His voice, when it finally came, was low and direct. "You signed this?" Brandon didn't answer. That silence. That was the moment the room shifted. For years he'd performed the role of the charming son, the successful husband, the man who knew how to handle things. But tonight, his script was gone. His spotlight burned out, and all that was left was a man in a sweater holding the shredded illusion of control. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand. I just sat steady as a storm front and let the facts speak louder than his charisma ever could. Beside me, Beth reached under the table and squeezed my hand. I didn't look at her, but I felt it, the quiet confirmation that she knew. That she'd always known. Brandon looked down at the sonogram photo still resting on the table, half tucked beneath the prenup folder. It wasn't just ink and ultrasound waves, it was a sentence. A sentence he'd never get to rewrite. He muttered, "How do I even know it's mine?" That was the moment I almost cracked. Almost. But I stayed still. Because I'm still your wife. For 7 more business days. And unlike you, I know how to keep a record. He flinched. His mother gasped. Nate shifted in his chair like he wanted to disappear into the wood grain. I pushed the leather folder back across the table, closed. "This isn't a negotiation," I said. "It's a conclusion." I stood, smoothed my dress, and walked toward the kitchen. My heels barely made a sound. Behind me, the room didn't erupt. It collapsed. In silence. Because when a smart woman serves silent prenup revenge, she doesn't raise her voice, she raises the stakes. "You filed first," Brandon's father repeated low and slow, as if saying it again might soften the blow. Without telling anyone, Brandon didn't respond. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Around the Christmas table, what had once felt like family tradition, roast turkey-polished silverware wine glasses, catching the candlelight, now felt like a courtroom. And he was the only one on trial. Beth returned from the kitchen with 2 mugs of peppermint tea. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just set mine down and sat beside me, folding her napkin like she was waiting for closing arguments. Brandon's mother finally broke the silence. "Brandon, why would you serve her papers at dinner?" Still, he said nothing, because he knew. This wasn't a private mistake anymore. This was a public unraveling playing out beneath crystal chandeliers and linen napkins. I picked up my tea, calm as ever. "You weren't trying to be discreet," I said, not even looking at him. "You were trying to humiliate me." Nate shifted in his chair. Beth didn't move, but the message landed. Brandon turned to me, angry now. Desperate. "So what you've been planning this? Documenting me, keeping tabs?" I looked him in the eye for the first time since dinner started. "Since the last time you told me I'd be nothing without you." His jaw tensed. His mother gasped again quietly this time and reached for her wine. I let the silence hold. I wanted them to feel it, the weight of every invisible bruise, every dismissed comment, every eye roll that chipped away at the woman I used to be. "I wasn't plotting," I said. "I was surviving." That landed harder than any accusation. Because it was true. Behind every smile I forced, every meal I cooked, every "You're right, honey," I whispered to keep the peace I was surviving. A man who turned sarcasm into sport and silence into punishment. Across from me, Brandon leaned back, trying to reclaim some space. It didn't work. He was already smaller than the man who walked into this dinner. "You think this changes everything?" he asked, half laughing, half daring. "No," I said. "It reveals everything." He reached for the leather folder again, flipping to the back pages, like a gambler hoping for a miracle card. "You didn't even let me explain," he muttered. "There's nothing left to explain," I said. "The documents speak louder than you ever did." Beth reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. She slid it to me under the table. I opened it. Inside, a single printed screenshot. A text from Brandon to Nate. Dated 3 days before Christmas. "I'm doing it at dinner. Bet she'll cry. Drinks will soften the blow. Nate, bring the folder." My hands didn't shake. I placed it next to the sonogram photo on the table. Brandon saw it. He recognized the message. He went completely still. "You were planning a show?" I said quietly. "You just didn't expect the curtain to rise on you." His sister looked at him then. Really looked at him. "You're unbelievable," she said, pushing her chair back. His father didn't speak. He just reached for the prenup again and read it like it was a language he'd never been taught. "Why Christmas?" his mother asked, voice shaking. "Why now?" I turned toward her. "Because it's the day he chose." Brandon slammed his hands down on the table, but it was weak. A gesture with no audience left. And that's when the doorbell rang. The entire table stiffened. Beth's eyes met mine. Nate looked like he might run. "I'll get it," I said. I stood, walked calmly down the hallway, and opened the door. A man in a black wool coat stood outside holding a thin manila envelope. "Stephanie Whitaker." "Yes, confirmation of delivery, petition for divorce, filed 3 days ago, served today." He offered a polite nod. "Merry Christmas." I nodded back. "You too." I took the envelope, closed the door, and returned to the dining room. Brandon was still at the table, head in his hands. I set the envelope gently beside his untouched turkey. "It's done," I said. "And just like you wanted, served at dinner." Then I turned to the rest of the table. "Anyone want dessert?" He did not reach for the envelope, not even to move it aside. It sat there between the gravy boat and his untouched slice of turkey, a manila reminder that the man in control was no longer in charge. The candles burned lower, casting golden light across wine-stained napkins and the slow collapse of a facade. I looked across the table, not at Brandon, but at the people who had once cheered for him. His mother silent, now twisting her ring. His father, arms crossed, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, scanning him like a flawed contract. Nate nowhere to be found. He had slipped into the hallway, suddenly checking his phone. I sipped my tea and smiled. Not to provoke, not to gloat. But because the cinnamon was warm, the glass was real crystal, and for the first time in 8 years, I had nothing to fear in my own home. "You really think this makes you strong?" Brandon finally said. "Smiling like that? What is this, some kind of performance? My eyes met his. Steady. Calm. This is peace, I replied. You just don't recognize it because you've never lived inside it? Beth stifled a laugh. Not loud. Just a sharp breath she turned into a cough. Across the table, even Brandon's sister let her gaze fall to the tablecloth. No one came to his defense. Because the holiday betrayal he planned had flipped and they knew it. His fork scraped against his plate once aimless before he pushed it away. Okay, he said. So, you filed. So you caught me off guard. That doesn't mean you get everything. I didn't flinch. You gave me everything, Brandon. The day you signed that napkin. He leaned back in his chair, trying to reassert dominance. It was a joke. No, I said. It was documented. And now it's enforceable. He hated that word. Enforceable. It was the end of charm. The start of consequences. He could flirt his way out of restaurant bills, joke through tense meetings, even gaslight me into second-guessing my memories. But he couldn't erase a notary stamp. Brandon wasn't just unraveling, he was watching his power collapse in front of the people who once clapped for his wit. You're doing this for revenge, he said bitterly. You're just angry. I shook my head. I was angry. Back when you called me useless under your breath. Back when you told your boss I was just the wife. Back when I found receipts and made excuses for you. I'm not angry anymore, Brandon. I leaned forward slightly. Now I'm done. He looked stunned, not by the words, but by the restraint, like he had been bracing for a breakdown, not a reclamation of power. Because smart woman revenge isn't loud, it's precise. Beth stood. I think we could all use some air. She motioned toward the porch, giving the family a gracious exit. His mother followed, then his sister, then his father, still holding his wine glass like it had turned to glass in his hand. Only Brandon and I remained, alone. Finally. You planned this for months, he muttered. I prepared, I corrected. There's a difference. He stood abruptly. I made one mistake. That doesn't erase everything. One mistake, I echoed, incredulous. Which one? The hotel room on Valentine's? The text message I found 2 weeks ago? Or the bet you and Nate made in the hallway before dinner? He froze. I let the silence wrap around us like a second skin. You knew, he asked, quieter now. I heard every word. I didn't say more. I didn't need to. He was already starting to crumble under the weight of his own bravado. That wasn't... I didn't mean you never do, I said, cutting him off. But somehow the damage is always done. He sat down slowly, like the chair might disappear underneath him. I don't want to lose everything, he said. I nodded. Then maybe you shouldn't have treated me like I was nothing. The sound of the door creaked in the background. Beth was back, her head peeking through the frame. You good? I nodded once. Just finishing up. She came back in, gently lifting the plates, stacking them without comment. Brandon didn't move to help. He just sat there, silent, defeated, watching the woman he tried to erase become the author of her own ending. I stood and picked up the sonogram photo. 8 weeks, I said. And she's healthy. He asked softly. Yes. He looked down at his hands, then back up. Can I be part of her life that depends? I said. Can you learn how to respect one? He didn't answer. Because men like Brandon aren't used to being questioned. They're used to applause, laughter, the benefit of the doubt. But tonight, all he had left was the echo of a woman's footsteps walking out of the room, calm, dignified, unstoppable. Beth followed me back into the kitchen. Are you okay? I set down the sonogram next to the sink. Yeah. For the first time in a long time, I actually am. She smiled. You didn't scream. You didn't cry. That was quiet, I offered. No, she said. It was loud in all the ways that mattered. Because the best revenge at Christmas isn't ruin, it's reclaiming your own story at the very table where they tried to write you out. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of quiet I used to dread. It wasn't the cold silence that used to settle in after one of Brandon's jokes landed too hard, or after he walked past me in the kitchen without speaking, expecting me to take the hint and apologize for what I rarely knew. No, this was a new quiet, a calm one. I stood at the sink, rinsing dishes, the last of the spiced wine scent still hanging in the air. Behind me, Beth folded napkins. She hadn't said much since the final exchange. Not because she was avoiding it, but because she knew there was power in not rushing the moment. Some silences mean safety. Others mean surrender. This one meant clarity. And for Brandon, it meant the collapse of everything he'd counted on staying hidden. The phone buzzed on the counter. Not mine. His. He'd left it sitting there when he followed his father outside to clear the air. But the lock screen lit up, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't have to brace myself for what it might say. I didn't need to pick it up. I didn't need to snoop. I already knew who he was. That was the difference now. He had been so sure that his toxic behavior would never catch up to him, that the world would keep mistaking charm for character. But tonight had shown him otherwise. In front of his parents, his sister, his best friend, and me, the woman who used to explain away his sharpness as sarcasm and his absences as ambition. Now there was nothing left to interpret, just documents, signatures, dates, truth. Beth handed me a clean towel. You did it, she said simply. I shook my head. Not yet, but I'm close. Because this wasn't about one night. This was the midpoint of a longer unraveling. One that began the moment I stopped hoping he'd change and started preparing for the day I'd walk away without looking back. You're stronger than I was, Beth added. When Eric left me, I couldn't even breathe. I looked at her surprised. You never told me that. She shrugged. That's what we do, right? We protect the image, even when we're bleeding under it. I nodded. She was right. So many women live in glass houses with curtains drawn, smiling, cooking, laughing at the right moments, even when the walls are cracking beneath their feet. Brandon's voice drifted in through the back door. Low, defensive. I could tell he was trying to salvage whatever reputation remained with his father. But something in his tone had changed. He wasn't angry, he was scared. Because when you've spent years presenting the perfect marriage to your family, and then your wife calmly dismantles it with evidence dates and a pregnancy you didn't plan for, the mask doesn't just slip, it shatters. And all he had left was the same silence he used to weaponize against me. Beth leaned against the counter. You know he's going to try to talk you out of this, right? He already tried, I said. She raised an eyebrow. And I didn't flinch. The door creaked. Brandon reappeared. He looked tired, older. The color in his face uneven, like someone who had just been told a truth he couldn't undo. He stepped into the kitchen like it wasn't his house anymore. Because it wasn't. Not really. I'm staying at Nate's tonight, he said. I'll come by tomorrow for my stuff. Make a list, I replied. Text it to me. I'll box it up. He looked stunned by the efficiency, like he'd expected a fight, a plea, some final grasp at what we had. But the truth was, what we had was gone long before tonight. It faded slowly through the jokes that weren't funny, the criticisms disguised as advice, the passive-aggressive sighs that turned into full sentences. And by the time he realized I'd stopped reacting, I had already begun recording. Not with a camera, with clarity. I didn't mean to humiliate you, he said. I met his eyes. You just wanted to catch me off guard. For sport. He didn't deny it. He just nodded. Because toxic men rarely say the worst part out loud. They live in the gray. The smirk. The suggestion. The public just kidding after the private cut. But I wasn't playing that game anymore. Does your dad know about the texts? I asked. His face tightened. What texts? The ones between you and her? The plans to file the gifts, the bets? Nate was involved. You think your father won't care that you dragged the family name into this? He looked away. And that was the moment I saw it again, not the cruelty, but the cowardice. The realization that he had burned everything down trying to stay warm in his own ego. He started toward the hallway, then paused. Steph. I waited. I didn't think you'd do it, he said quietly. I thought you'd fold. I smiled. You bet I'd cry. Then I turned away. Because the most powerful moment in any revenge story isn't the confrontation. It's the walk away. Brandon left, without another word. When the door closed behind him, Beth exhaled sharply and reached for the pie again. Want a slice? I nodded. Apple or pecan apple? With whipped cream. She served it while I sat down at the smaller breakfast table, the one Brandon always said was too casual for guests. It felt right tonight. Unpretentious. Honest. We ate in silence, but this time it was the kind that held gratitude. Not grief. Later that night, I tucked the sonogram photo into a new frame I had picked up months ago at a thrift store. I hadn't known why I bought it then. But now, I understood. The frame said, "You are stronger than you think." The next morning, I stood barefoot on the cold kitchen tile, watching the coffee pot finish its quiet drip. It was the same machine I'd used for years, but this time, it sounded different. It sounded like mine. Like silence I didn't have to tiptoe through. Like space I didn't have to apologize for. I poured a mug, added a splash of oat milk, and carried it to the window overlooking our frozen backyard. The garden beds were dusted in frost. The patio chairs still held a thin blanket of snow from 2 nights ago. It was December 26th, the day after what was supposed to be a magical family Christmas. Instead, it was the first day of my real life. Because holiday betrayal doesn't have to end in disaster. Sometimes it leads straight to liberation. I didn't cry. I didn't pace the hallway or replay the dinner in my head. I didn't check his social media or wonder who he was texting from Nate's guest room. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that I had finally exhaled, and the air I was breathing was mine. My phone buzzed. A message from Jenny Keys changed. Documents filed. Stay ready, but rest today. You earned it. She was always like that, efficient, sharp, but soft, in the places I didn't know I needed softness. I texted back a simple heart emoji and set my phone down. The house still smelled faintly like pine and cinnamon. My body still held the muscle memory of setting the Christmas table, refilling wine, placing that gold-wrapped box beside Brandon's smugness. But now, it all felt like a dream I had walked out of. Beth emerged from the guest room wrapped in a gray robe, her hair in a messy bun, her feet already in my slippers. "You're up early?" she said, rubbing her eyes. "I never really slept," I replied, smiling. She poured herself coffee and joined me by the window. We didn't say much for a while, just stood side by side, watching the sky turn pink above the frosted rooftops. "You did something impossible," she said eventually. "You made him feel small without making yourself ugly." I nodded slowly. I didn't want revenge. I know. I just wanted my voice back. And I had it now. In the days that followed, I started sorting through the house, not for him, not even for the court filings, but for me. I opened every drawer, every box, every dusty closet that had become a graveyard of old dreams and silent compromises. There were photo albums I hadn't touched in years, receipts from trips he said we'd go on together, and never did gifts I had bought him that he never acknowledged. I packed his things neatly into cardboard boxes, labeled with clean handwriting. Not bitter, not frantic, just organized. Because silent revenge isn't just about what you do to someone else. It's about what you reclaim from the ruins they left behind. I lit candles he used to complain about. I turned on music he used to call too emotional. I wore the red sweater he once said looked too loud for your age. And every time I passed the mirror, I looked a little more like myself. Jenny came by that Friday with soup legal updates and a bottle of non-alcoholic sparkling wine. We sat on the couch, legs curled up like teenagers reviewing paperwork and case notes, while my sonogram photo sat quietly on the mantel. "He'll contest custody," she said flatly. "He'll say it's sudden, that he deserves partial parenting." I nodded. "Let him. I have receipts, timelines, journals, and I have this house. And me," she added, "and Beth, and clarity. That's better than any courtroom." I smiled. We clinked glasses. "To clarity," I said. After she left, I stayed up late organizing the nursery. I didn't know if I'd paint it yet, or just let the light color the walls in the morning. I placed the rocking chair near the window and set a soft yellow blanket over the back. At midnight, I curled up in bed and opened the leather journal I'd started weeks before. I titled the next page in careful print December 26th, First Breath. And then I wrote, "Today I woke up and didn't shrink. I walked through the house and didn't apologize to the walls. I lit candles without asking. I listened to music without shame. I opened the curtains and let the light in because no one told me not to. This house is mine now. Not because of a prenup, but because I finally walked all the way back to myself." I closed the journal, placed it gently on the nightstand, and turned off the light. That night, I slept diagonally across the bed. The next morning, I called the locksmith again, this time to install a keypad and security cameras. Not because I was afraid, but because freedom deserves protection. He arrived around noon, a soft-spoken man named Doug, who reminded me of my uncle. While he worked, I made sandwiches and offered him tea. We chatted about the weather, the holidays, nothing of substance. But it felt good. Ordinary. Safe. Before he left, he looked at me and said, "You look like someone who's just starting fresh." I smiled. "That's exactly right. And I meant it. Because toxic husbands don't just take up space in your house, they take up space in your spirit. And the only way to evict them completely is to stop giving them your breath." That evening, I stood at the kitchen island with Beth making a grocery list. We wrote down things Brandon never liked: garlic hummus, sourdough, sparkling cranberry juice. "What about ice cream?" she asked. I laughed. "Pick your flavor. We're not rationing for mood swings anymore." The doorbell rang. I stiffened, old habit. Beth looked at me. "You want me to get it?" I nodded. It was a delivery, a large cardboard box, no return address. Beth carried it in, placed it gently on the floor. We opened it together. Inside, a framed photo of our wedding day, and a note in Brandon's handwriting. "Keep it. I won't need reminders. No apology, no explanation. Just that one final echo of the man he had been." Beth looked at me. "You okay?" I picked up the frame, studied our frozen smiles, my hopeful eyes, his confident smirk. "I think I'll donate it," I said, and that's exactly what I did, because you don't heal by hiding from the past. You heal by walking it to the door, thanking it for what it taught you, and letting it go. 3 days after Christmas, I received the first message. It was from one of Brandon's former colleagues, Rachel, the one who always wore sharp red lipstick and once told me at a holiday party, that I looked too gentle to be his wife. Her text came in at 8:12 a.m., just as I was wiping down the kitchen counters, my phone humming against the windowsill. I heard, "I'm not taking sides, but I saw things. Quiet things. Just wanted you to know I think you were brave." I stared at the screen for a full minute, letting the words settle. Not taking sides, yet sending a message. That was how it would begin, I realized. The social unraveling of a man who once owned the room. By lunchtime, I had 3 more messages. One from an old friend of Brandon's who just wanted to check in. One from a woman I didn't know well, but who used to sit beside me at the annual corporate gala. And one from my former neighbor, who had overheard Brandon's sarcasm too many times on the front lawn and never said a word until now. By sunset, I had lost 4 Instagram followers, 2 mutual friends, and 1 cousin. Beth watched me scroll from across the kitchen island. "Don't keep score," she said, gently sipping tea. "People reveal themselves. That's enough." But I wasn't keeping score. I was observing the quiet cost of truth. Because when you expose someone who made their cruelty palatable by charm, by success, by reputation, people get uncomfortable. They don't know where to stand. They don't want to believe the person they laughed with at barbecues is the same one who controlled what time his wife came home from book club. And some people would rather doubt the woman than confront the discomfort of believing her. That's the lonely part no one tells you about. You can win the legal battle. You can retain the house. You can even secure custody and prove betrayal with receipts and timelines. But still, people will whisper, hesitate, and sometimes vanish. And yet, as each message came in and each unfollow quietly registered, I felt something unexpected relief. Because every person who distanced themselves from me now had a name, a face, a shape I no longer had to contort myself around. That night, Beth and I curled up on the couch watching an old rom-com. I ate dark chocolate straight from the foil. She scrolled Pinterest for baby crib designs. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't loud. But it was the most peace I'd felt in years. Around 9:00 p.m., there was a knock at the door. Beth paused the movie. I held my breath, a flicker of old habit returning. Then I remembered the locks had been changed, the cameras installed, the boundaries redrawn. I walked to the door, looked through the peephole. "Jenny." I opened it with a smile. She stood there holding a bouquet of soft yellow tulips and a white envelope. "No casseroles today," she said with a grin. "Just flowers and paperwork." I laughed and let her in. "What's the envelope?" "Final confirmation from the court," she said, handing it over. "Everything is officially filed and processed. Custody arrangements, asset division, the works." I stared at the envelope for a second before opening it. The paper was cool in my hand, the ink crisp. Legal language, formatted margins stamped and approved. It was done. Really, truly done. Jenny sat beside me on the couch. "You okay?" I nodded. Better than okay. She looked at Beth, then back at me. "You know, the office receptionist cried when she read your file. Just the summary. She said, 'I wish my sister had done something like this.'" My throat tightened. I didn't do anything heroic. "You did something smart," Jenny said, "and kind. You didn't destroy him, you just stopped letting him destroy you." I folded the papers carefully and placed them on the mantel beside the sonogram photo. "I've been thinking about changing my name," I said quietly. Jenny raised an eyebrow. "Back to your maiden name," "No," I said. "Forward, to my own." They both smiled, because sometimes freedom isn't going back, it's choosing something completely new. That weekend I started making small changes to the house. I painted the bathroom the softest shade of green I could find. I donated the dishes. Brandon picked out the ones he said looked clean and masculine. I replaced them with handmade pottery bowls from a local artist. Each one was slightly irregular, imperfect. beautiful, because it bore the marks of becoming. On Sunday morning, I put on my coat and walked to the corner bakery. The air was crisp, the sidewalk still sprinkled with leftover salt. I passed the neighbor who had always waved at Brandon and not me. This time, he nodded. Inside the bakery, the woman behind the counter recognized me. "You're the one who had the big Christmas dinner, right?" she asked, smiling. I hesitated. "Yes," I said slowly. "That was me." I heard it got intense. I stiffened. She noticed. "No judgment," she said quickly. "Actually, good for you. Most people don't realize until it's too late." I nodded. "Thank you." Because word travels fast after a holiday scandal. And I was learning that not all whispers come with shame. Some come with quiet applause. That afternoon, a box arrived. From Brandon. Beth found it on the porch. "Should we open it?" I shook my head. Return to sender. I didn't need closure in the form of regrets or apologies wrapped in cardboard. What I needed, what I finally had, was clarity. That night, I wrote in my journal again, "I lost some people this week. But I also lost the version of me who needed them. And I gained something louder than applause, peace. Because when everyone else chooses sides, you don't have to beg them to pick yours. You just stand in the one place they never thought you'd reach your own." The morning I opened my laptop again, the cursor blinked like a dare. It had been weeks since I'd even looked at my resume. Months since I'd allowed myself to think beyond surviving. The old file was still there. Stephanie Whitaker, marketing director, but the name made my stomach twist. I didn't belong to that woman anymore. Not the one who bent her ambitions to fit inside someone else's spotlight. Not the one who rehearsed how to sound agreeable on Zoom calls so Brandon wouldn't criticize her tone after meetings. I created a new file. Stephanie W., independent consultant, brand strategy and resilience. Then I started writing. By noon, I had my first draft client pitch. By 3, I had emailed it to a former mentor who once told me, "If you ever go solo, you'll build an empire." Quietly. I wasn't just working again. I was reclaiming the future he thought I'd never reach without him. That evening, I filled out a form to reserve a co-working space downtown. It was a modest office, nothing flashy, but the chairs were ergonomic. The Wi-Fi was strong, and no one looked at me like I needed to be smaller to fit in. Beth came with me the next day to help set up. She brought a tiny succulent in a white pot and a bottle of sparkling water. "You know what I love?" she said, placing the plant beside my keyboard. "No one here calls you, just the wife." I smiled, not even in their heads. We sat in that space, me editing a proposal, her planning her next travel blog, and for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the invisible weight of managing someone else's emotions. I didn't have to censor my wins or downplay my goals. I was simply allowed to grow. Because the most powerful revenge isn't loud, it's expansion. Back at home, the nursery took on a new shape. Not just physically, but emotionally. I painted one wall sage green, added cream curtains with tiny embroidered stars, and hung framed prints of children's book quotes, each one chosen with care. Above the crib, I placed one that read, "You are safe. You are loved. You are allowed to take up space." Brandon never saw that wall. He hadn't asked. Since his departure, he had texted only once. It was short. "Let me know if you want to talk about custody. I'll be respectful." I didn't reply. Jenny handled it. That was the plan. I'd protect my child not with rage, but with systems, with signatures, with silence. Because when you've been through holiday betrayal and come out breathing softer, you no longer need to raise your voice to feel heard. You just need to walk in your truth with both hands free. One afternoon, while Beth was out and I was reorganizing the linen closet, the doorbell rang. I peeked through the window before opening it. It wasn't Brandon. It was Claire, his assistant. I hadn't seen her since last spring's gala. She used to call me the calm one, always with a smile that suggested she knew more than she let on. Now she stood on my porch with a wrapped package in hand and a strange look in her eyes. "I debated dropping this off," she said softly, "but I needed to." I opened the door, unsure. "Is that from him?" "No," she said. "It's from me." She handed me the package. It was wrapped in plain paper, sealed with a single piece of tape. "I found this on the server," she explained, "right after everything came out. I knew I'd never forgive myself if I didn't show you." I opened it after she left. Inside, a printed email thread between Brandon and a partner at his firm. From before Christmas. Jokes about the prenup, casual bragging about the perfect timing, and worst of all, a subject line that read, "Operation Merry Kiss-Off." My throat burned, but I didn't cry. I forwarded it to Jenny with a note just in case. Then I shredded the pages, because I didn't need more proof to hate him. I had already stopped giving him space in my mind. The next day, I received a referral from that same mentor I emailed earlier. A mid-sized brand was launching a women's wellness campaign and needed someone to craft their voice. The founder's message said, "I read your story. Someone shared your Christmas dinner moment. I think our audience needs someone who understands quiet power." I laughed, full-bodied and free. Even my pain had become purposeful. And when I pitched the campaign 2 days later from my new desk at the co-working space, I ended with the line I had scribbled in my journal weeks ago. "This isn't a comeback. It's a reset. A woman is not broken because she had to begin again." They signed the contract within hours. That night, I danced alone in the living room while pasta simmered on the stove, my belly just beginning to show beneath my sweatshirt. I played Nina Simone, let the soft jazz fill the corners of the room that once echoed with sarcasm and shallow praise. Beth returned home to find me twirling in socks, holding a wooden spoon like a microphone. "You okay?" She laughed. "I think I'm thriving," I said, because he thought I'd collapse. But instead, I had built something that didn't have room for him anymore. The invitation was simple pale yellow cardstock with gold lettering that read, "You are invited to celebrate a new beginning." No fancy monogram, no last name, just my first step followed by the words, "and baby girl." We held the baby shower in late January, just after a light snowstorm had dusted the town. I rented the small event room at a local cafe with whitewashed brick walls, hanging fern baskets and soft jazz on repeat. It wasn't extravagant, but it was warm, intentional mine, just like everything else I had begun reclaiming. Beth planned the entire thing. She insisted. "You need to feel surrounded," she said. "Not just safe scene." She was right. And that day, I was. Jenny arrived first, carrying 2 large gift bags, a bottle of sparkling cider, and a grin that could melt frost. "I brought paperwork for later," she teased, "but first we're here to celebrate your second heartbeat." My hands instinctively touched my belly. 22 weeks. A flutter, a turn, a small push against my ribs had already become part of my mornings. This baby was real. She was not a reset, she was a rising. As guests trickled in, I was surprised by who came. A former colleague who had once overheard Brandon mock my ideas during a conference call and later emailed me a quiet, "That wasn't okay." The barista from my favorite cafe who had seen me cry into my journal last fall and slid a note across the counter that said, "Whatever it is, you'll walk through it." Even Claire, Brandon's former assistant, showed up with a blanket she'd hand-knitted in soft purples and creams. "No last names needed," she said as she hugged me. "Just women who understand." There were about 20 people in total. Not the hundreds Brandon used to collect at networking events, where I was always introduced as his wife and nothing more. These people weren't here for obligation. They were here because they had seen me go silent and then stand up. This was chosen family. This was earned circle. This was the opposite of everything he had tried to convince me I'd lose. The gifts were modest. A diaper bag. A framed poem. Books with titles like Strong Girls with Soft Hearts and Your Mama is Magic. Each one felt like a whisper to the future proof that love doesn't have to be loud to be lasting. Midway through, Beth tapped her spoon against a glass. "Okay," she said, "we're doing the one thing Steph hates, speeches." Laughter rose, and I blushed. "Please, no." But she continued anyway. I watched my sister sit through years of being minimized, of being told she was too emotional, too dramatic, too fragile. I watched her shrink to keep the peace, and I watched her disappear in rooms where she once used to light them up. She paused, her voice steady. And then one day, she didn't disappear anymore. She didn't yell. She didn't fight. She just prepared. Quietly. Powerfully. And this Christmas, she gave the greatest gift, not just to herself, but to every woman who's ever stayed too long in a house that wasn't home. Silence fell over the room. Not awkward, not unsure. Just deep collective knowing. Beth raised her glass. To Steph. And to baby girl. May she grow up knowing that silence isn't weakness, it's wisdom. We clinked glasses, sparkling cider fizzing like tiny gold stars. I sat there blinking back tears. Not the kind Brandon had bet on. Not broken tears. These were whole. Solid. Releasing. When it was time to open gifts, I saved Beth's for last. It was a small box wrapped in lavender paper. Inside, a silver bracelet, thin and delicate, with one word engraved on the inside. Enough. I ran my thumb across the etching. "You are?" Beth said softly. "You always were." Later, as the room quieted and guests slowly trickled out, one woman stayed behind. She was older, mid-60s maybe, with silver streaks through her hair, and the kind of eyes that held stories. She had introduced herself earlier as a friend of Jenny's, but I hadn't caught her name. Now she stood across from me with a gentle smile. "You know," she said, "when I left my husband 30 years ago, my pastor told me no one would want a woman with baggage." She glanced at my belly. I told him I wasn't baggage. I was luggage. Carefully packed, full of stories, and ready to travel far. I laughed, the kind that shakes loose something hidden. She stepped forward and squeezed my hand. "You're not starting over. You're moving forward. Big difference." And just like that, she left. But her words stayed. That night, I hung the bracelet beside my bed next to the sonogram photo and the nursery checklist Beth had made. I sat down with my journal and wrote, "He wasn't invited, because he's no longer the center of anything. This baby doesn't need a man who mocked his partner. She needs a mother who refuses to model self-erasure." And today, I gave her that. Across town, I imagined Brandon hearing about the shower. Maybe from his sister. Maybe from a cousin who saw a photo online. Maybe he'd ask, "Was I mentioned?" Maybe they'd answer, "Not once." And maybe for the first time, he'd feel it, the sting of irrelevance. Because the greatest revenge is being absent from the story he still thought he could control. The day I brought my daughter home, the wind outside was soft and slow, as if even the sky knew something sacred was unfolding. Beth drove us from the hospital. The back seat cradled a car seat small enough to hold everything that mattered now. 8 pounds, 2 ounces of resilience wrapped in a butter-yellow blanket. Her fingers were impossibly tiny. Her lashes already long. She slept through the whole ride, her breath steady, unaware of how much ground had been cleared for her to arrive in peace. The front porch had a new welcome mat. Soft place to land. It was Beth's idea. She said every child should walk into love, not tension. I had decorated the nursery weeks ago, but stepping into it with her in my arms felt like entering it for the first time. The walls glowed in the early afternoon light. The rocking chair faced the window, and the sage green paint calmed the air like a lullaby. I held her against my chest and swayed gently. The weight of her, the warmth, the quiet, it anchored me more than any vow I'd ever spoken. Because this was the family I had chosen, not through marriage, but through healing. Brandon didn't show up at the hospital. There was no card, no call. Only a short email from his lawyer 2 days prior, confirming he would respect the boundaries of the agreement. Jenny handled it with one sentence. Steph has everything she needs. She was right. My daughter stirred slightly in my arms, letting out a soft sigh. I kissed her forehead. You're home, I whispered, and we're safe. I had worried for a while about the story I'd have to tell her someday. About the missing presence, the absence that once wore a title. But I realized something the moment I laid her in her crib: what's missing doesn't define us, what we build does. Over the next few weeks, we fell into rhythm. Beth stayed during the nights, helping with feedings, folding laundry, making tea. Jenny came by every Sunday with groceries and legal updates, though those grew fewer by the day. Friends sent flowers, cards. A few even stopped by with hand-sewn booties and freezer meals. There were no questions about Brandon. He had become a silence that no longer echoed. One afternoon, while the baby napped and I sipped warm cider in the sunroom, I opened the journal again. I hadn't written since the baby shower. But now, something inside me needed to finish the sentence I had started weeks ago. He said I'd be nothing without him. I let the pen hover. Then wrote, and he was wrong. Because today, I held a new life in my arms, in a home that breathes without fear, built from the ground up, with courage and clarity. I'm not just someone's ex-wife. I'm someone's mother, and she will never watch me disappear to keep the peace. She will watch me live. That night, Beth cooked pasta and played soft music while the baby slept in her bassinet beside the table. I lit the sandalwood candles Brandon once claimed gave him headaches. Their scent drifted through the kitchen like permission. Permission to stay soft, to stay whole, to stay mine. We toasted with sparkling apple cider. No fancy glasses. Just two women who had walked through separate fires and found a shared warmth on the other side. To the future, Beth said. To the foundation, I replied. Later, I stood in the nursery, watching the mobile above the crib turn slowly, tiny stars spinning in a slow circle, casting faint shadows on the wall. My daughter opened her eyes. Big, clear. Knowing nothing yet of pain, only of closeness. I smiled. I don't need him, I whispered, and neither will you. Outside, the wind picked up, gently rattling the last few leaves from the trees, but inside, everything held, not just the roof. Me, I held. Because revenge didn't come from what I ruined, it came from what I protected. And that was everything. What stays with me is not the prenup or even the dinner. It's the moment she stood in a house built with her own breath, holding peace in one hand and her daughter in the other. She didn't fight for applause. She made room for her life to grow louder than her grief. If this story reminded you that dignity is the quietest kind of power, hit subscribe to keep hearing kindness echo after heartbreak.